Hello guys, welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're going to be talking about the US state of Alaska and its politics, which I happen to think are some of the most interesting politics in the United States. So first of all, let's go over the 2024 presidential election. This is a state that Donald Trump is probably going to win. Alaska has not voted for a Democrat since 1964 when it voted for Lyndon B. Johnson. Ever since then, the state has been solidly red. However, the city of Anchorage did vote for Biden in 2020, and the state as a whole has gotten a lot closer recently. But still, as you can see with the polls, Donald Trump 47%, Kamala Harris 42%. Maybe Donald Trump will do a little bit worse than he did in 2020. He won by around 10% of the vote. But this is not a race that Kamala Harris is going to win. This is going to be a race that will go to Donald Trump. And that's pretty much the end of the presidential race. However, the House race is a completely different discussion. So the House race is contested by Mary Peltola and Nick Begich III, who is the grandson of Nick Begich, who was the last Democrat to represent Alaska before Mary Peltola was elected in a 2022 special election. Now, Mary Peltola is fairly moderate, but that has allowed her to win in the state, and she's one of the only Democrats to hold statewide office in Alaska in a very long time. Here, if you can see by polls, they're all Republican-leaning pollsters, mainly sponsored by the Begich campaign, this one by Begich, this one by the National Republican Congressional Committee, and this one also by the NRCC. Some forecasting websites currently rate this race as a toss-up, while a few still rate this as a lean D. I would lean more towards toss-up, but I do think Mary Peltola will win this race. A big reason why she won in the first place was because in 2022, in the special election, two Republicans were vying for the seat. Now, Mary Peltola was the only Democrat going for it, and that obviously helped her a little bit, but the main reason that she won was because of ranked choice voting, which was approved by Alaska voters in 2020 as a ballot measure. And this allows voters to rank candidates in the order that they prefer them. Nick Begich was eliminated first, so his votes were split between Mary Peltola and Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin, being not very popular, actually didn't get as many votes from the other Republican as she would have needed. As you can see there, the two Republicans combined got 58% of the vote, and Mary Peltola only got 40 in the first round. But a lot of the Begich voters went to Mary Peltola in the second round, which helped her win the state by a pretty small margin. This race was considered to be a really massive upset. Obviously, with ranked choice voting, it's hard to say, but if you look at the polls here, Nick Begich was getting a majority when it was between Mary Peltola and him, but because it was between Sarah Palin and Mary Peltola, then it was a completely different story. Now, Sarah Palin is more extreme, and I think that played into why this race went the way it did. Obviously, if we look at the race again, this was a special. In November of that same year, the election was held again. Palin ran again, Begich ran again, and Peltola, obviously being the incumbent, ran again. And Peltola this time won by 10 points. In 2022, which was a year that the Republicans did well on a national level, Mary Peltola still won by even more than she did in the special. So if we look at the polls for this one, you will see Mary Peltola doing much better at this point. A big reason for this, I believe, is that Alaska as a whole is much more moderate as a state than other solidly Republican states. Obviously, there's the issue of oil. That's probably a big factor in why Alaska votes the way it does, given the Democratic Party stances on renewable energy and fossil fuels. But as a whole, the state's pretty moderate when it comes to social issues and pretty much every single other issue. So when you have a moderate Republican, which is Nick Begich, and a more right-wing Republican, which is Sarah Palin. The Democrat, which is also a moderate, is going to win because most of the voters are moderate. However, most of the Republican voters, by a small fraction, look at that difference between Palin and Begich, 2%. By a small fraction, the more right-wing voters of the Republican Party are more influential and are a greater faction. So, when you get a race like this, Mary Peltola will win because the more moderate voters will vote for her over the more right-wing Republican. Now, if you go back, you will see that now it's only two candidates because after the primary, in which Mary Peltola got exactly 50% of the vote, the Lieutenant Governor Nancy Dahlstrom withdrew from the race to avoid the situation that Palin caused. So it remains to be seen how this will go. I think Peltola will still win by a very small margin, but I think she will still win. So let's go see a big reason for that. Because Mary Peltola is the most popular politician in Alaska right now. She outpaces Lisa Murkowski, who's also moderate. She outpaces the governor. She outpaces Donald Trump. She outpaces Dahlstrom, which no one has an opinion on, it seems like. Biden, and pretty much everyone else, with a net positive favorability and a majority of the people polled in March of 2024, in end of February, beginning of March, say that they have a favorable view of her. So that's actually a really significant thing, and that really does help explain why Alaska is voting the way it does for the House election. Another thing that needs to be considered is the makeup of the Alaska state legislature. This is probably one of the weirdest things that any state does, but if you see here, the legislative control is actually split because the Democrats control the Senate and the Republicans control the House of Representatives, except the Democrats only have 9 of the 20 seats, and the Republicans are caucusing with the Democrats. Most of them are caucusing with the Democrats. And a few Democrats are caucusing with the Republicans in the House, which is super interesting when you think about it. Even now, there's one Republican down here with the Democrats and 4 independents, and then a non-caucusing Republican. So you have a state that has a really interesting bipartisan, moderate makeup. There's not as much polarization when it comes to the way in which the parties interact. And that definitely influences how these elections go and why Peltola is even able to win. Because if this was a state like Nebraska, if this was a state like Oklahoma, a Democrat, even with the worst Republican candidate imaginable, would never win. A Democrat would not stand a chance. Most voters would see the Republican Party name next to the candidate, and that's who they would vote for. But in Alaska, that's not the case. In 2022, same election as Mary Peltola, the incumbent governor, who is Mike Dunleavy, won re-election to a second term by 25, 26 points. Although if you look at it, it's not as much as you think because the vote was split between the Democrat and the independent, but he did win in the first round. So he would have still likely won by about maybe 15 points if the independents' votes are split between the Democrat and the Republican. But this was the same ballot as Mary Peltola, and Mary Peltola was able to win here. Mary Peltola was able to win on the same ticket as Mike Dunleavy, which means that a lot of voters did split their tickets. At the very least, 5% of voters did, which it's interesting. It's very interesting to see that voters are able to break out of the traditional two-party politics and split their tickets at a much higher rate than you would see in other states. Also in Alaska was the Senate election that year, which was between Lisa Murkowski and another Republican, which was Kelly Shibaka. And now Murkowski is fairly moderate, as you saw with the approval polls. She was also one of the most popular politicians in Alaska, and that's a big reason why. Shibaka, on the other hand, was a Trump endorsed candidate, and she ended up losing by about 6, 7 points. And that, although not as significant as the Peltola win, this is still pretty interesting to see that a Trump endorsed candidate will lose against the non endorsed candidate in Alaska. Of course, Murkowski has her own political brand, with her father being the governor when she was appointed and then elected, but it doesn't matter. The fact is, Donald Trump doesn't enjoy as much power over the Alaska Republican voter base as he would in other states. Most Trump endorsed candidates obviously went on to win their primaries and then either win or lose in the general elections. But in this case, the Trump endorsed candidate lost what is essentially a jungle primary, which is really interesting to see. So that's pretty much Alaska. Alaska has a really moderate voter core that allows voters to really split their tickets in a way that would not be seen in another state that has as much of a partisan lean as this one. Maybe with exception to like Vermont having a Republican governor or Maryland having a Republican governor. But for the most part, those are like excessively moderate Republicans. Although Mary Peltola is a fairly moderate Democrat, I wouldn't categorize it as the same thing. Peltola is not to the right of center, I would say, when people like Phil Scott, who is the governor of Vermont, he is probably a little bit left of center when it comes to things like social issues, which voters tend to care about, but a little bit center right when it comes to more economic issues, which Republicans do tend to do better on. They tend to do better on that with the voter base. So obviously that helps to swing some voters that would otherwise be solid Democratic voters. So, like I said, moderate voters in Alaska even affect federal level races like a House race, which you wouldn't see in many other states. So Alaska in general has really interesting politics, and I encourage you all to read more on this because this is something that I think in the future Alaska could become more of a swing state. Maybe not on the presidential level, although I do think Trump's margin will decrease. I don't think it'll be competitive for the next few cycles, but maybe on a Senate level, a governor race, I think Alaska is definitely a state to watch. I think Alaska is definitely a state that is heading towards the Democratic side, much like Iowa used to be a swing state, now it's a Republican state. This is the opposite. Alaska going from a safe Republican state to maybe a toss-up state in the future. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you all later.